Okay, so we want to go over the quiz review questions so that you guys can feel better about going into your quiz on Thursday. So I'm going to quickly run through each of these, but you have control of the video on. You can stop it, you can fast forward, anything like that. You just need to do what is best for you. So for number one, to solve this one, it's already in the zero product property. We have one thing times another. And so with the zero product property says at least one of those has to be zero. So you're going to break this down into 4x minus 3 is equal to 0 and x plus 7 is equal to 0. So solve each one. On this side, we would add 3, divide by 4, and we get 3/4. Now, if you could leave it at the fraction, it would be 3/4, or that would be 0.75. Both of those would be accepted on Canvas. And then here, subtract 7, and we get -7. Just remember on Canvas, don't use spaces for your negatives because it just kind of throws off. We usually don't put that as one of our options. Okay, for number two, same idea. It's already factored. So we're going to do the zero product property again. So this outside piece has a variable. So we do set it equal to 0. If it were just a 2, like a GCF, then we don't set that equal to 0 because it doesn't have a variable. It's not going to give us a solution. So on the left, divide both sides by 2 and x equals 0. And on the right, add 1 and x equals 1. So that should have been a really nice, easy one to type into Canvas. For number 3, there's lots and lots and lots of different ways you could answer this, and we're looking for your opinion. So given 4y squared minus 9 equals 0, what method would you use to solve and why? Personally, I would use the square root method because there's no b term. That's me. I would take 4y squared minus 9 equals 0, add the 9, divide by the 4, square root, and I would get plus or minus 3/2. And I didn't show every step there because I'm kind of running out of space. But my explanation, and I would write it out, is I would use the square root method because there is not a b term. So make sure you would actually write that out. You could have also factored this. So some of you may have seen that. 4y squared minus 9 is a difference of 2 squares. So it would factor to be 2y plus 3 times 2y minus 3. And then you would set each of these equal to 0, and you would get the exact same answer as the square root method. To me, this does take a little bit more work, but it does get you there. And finish up this side, we get the positive of it. So that's the same answer as plus and minus 3/2. So if you wanted to go that route, your explanation would be I would use the factoring method because I could tell this is a difference of 2 squares or something along those lines. Then you can also do the quadratic formula if you are really in love with it. To me, that's the most challenging method to use for this. If you do that, you're going to have to recognize that A is 4, B is 0, and C is -9. So I'm not going to show that method because it's going to take me quite a while. I don't really have that much space left. But if you really, really wanted to, you could do the quadratic formula because it does work for everything. It just does take the most amount of work from all of our methods. Okay, so then we get to 4. And 4, you have to decide, well, what method are we going to use? So you're not going to be able to use the square root method because it has the b. So that method is out. So we look to see, can it factor? And this one can. So you might have to do some guessing and checking, but eventually you would get to x minus 6 and x minus 4. Set each of those equal to 0. We get 6, positive 6, and positive 4. Those will be our two answers for that one. All right, 5, the first thing I notice is, well, I can't use the square root method again because of that 53x. So for factoring in the quadratic formula, those have to get c equal to 0. So that's the first thing that I'm going to take care of is, 10x squared minus 53x minus 11 equals 0. And remember that when you do get it equal to 0, that you need to put it in standard form so that if you have to use the quadratic formula, your A, B, and C are in the correct order, or it's very likely that you will make a mistake. Okay? So again, I look at this and I go, can it factor? Now 53 is kind of a big number, but this one actually does factor. If you do a little bit of guessing and checking, you can come up with 2x minus 11 and 5x plus 1. So then when you set each of those equal to 0, solve each of those, divide by 2, you get 11 halves. And again, the direction said you can do fraction or decimal. So as a decimal, this would be 5.5. Either one of those is totally fine. And then on this side here, subtract the 1, divide by 5, you get negative 1/5, or that's negative 0.2. So those would be your correct answers for that. And again, you can use the quadratic formula, but it is nicer, or I find it easier if we can factor it. Okay, 6, again, because I have that g, I cannot use the square root method. So I'm going to add 38g to both sides and make sure that when I rewrite it, I get it in standard form. So again, I look to see, can this one factor? And it can. It's nice that my leading coefficient is 1. That's a 1g squared. And this one is g plus 36 and g plus 2. So when you set each of these equal to 0, you get negative 36 and negative 2 as your two answers. Okay. 7. So on here, so this one might be a little tricky. This one, when factoring it, I go, wait a minute, that's got a cubed in it. It's not squared. So that should kind of be a hint that there's a GCF. Not only is there a GCF of M, but both 50 and 32 are perfect squares. Or not perfect squares, they're even. So my GCF is actually going to be a 2M. If I factor that out, that gives me 25M squared minus 16. Now, from here, I can go a couple of directions. I can recognize that 25M squared minus 16 is a difference of two squares, so I can continue factoring. This would be 5M plus 4 and 5M minus 4. Or if I wanted to, I could have just set, I've got the zero product property in that first step. I could just set 25M squared minus 16 equal to 0 and then use the square root method. I'm going to end up with the same answer. So because my GCF did have a variable with it, I'm going to set it equal to 0. And that one gets me 0. Then I have my 5M plus 4. And that's going to get me negative 4/5. And then last one. So this one actually has 3 answers, which doesn't happen very often for us, but it is possible. Positive 4/5. Okay, so there's where you get all 3 of those. 8. So we look at 8, 4x squared minus 12x plus 9. It's already equal to 0. Can't use the square root method because of the 12x. So I look to see, can I factor? I kind of recognize that, hey, 4 is a perfect square, and so is 9. And there is this little trick that you can look at, or you can just do factor by guess and check. and notice, hey, that's a perfect square trinomial. That would factor out to be 2x minus 3 times 2x minus 3. And because those are the same, you only have to show us once. So 2x equals 3. I'm kind of out of space. I'm going to go over here. Divide by 2. Get 3 over 2. And when you guys take your Canvas quizzes, take the fact that if you only have one space in your answer, that likely it is a perfect square trinomial. Because the only other option that if it asked you to solve and it only has one answer box, that would be a no solution. So you can kind of do some reasoning on your own to think, oh, there's only one answer box. Maybe it's a perfect square trinomial. All right, for 9 and 10, I'm going to try to go into Canvas and remind you guys of what we can do here. So here is how you would have it on yours. And it says use the math quill button to write 3 plus or minus the square root of 7 in the space below. You guys are going to be asked to do this on Canvas. So you need to make sure that you know how to do it. So if I get into here, your math quill is this f of x button at the top right. And you have everything that you need inside of here. So it was 3. So I'm on iPad mode, so that's why this is popping up. But you would have your keyboard. And then I'm going to hit my plus and minus sign that's up here. Oops, I only need one of them. And then square root of 7. So your square root sign is that third one in the top right row, or top left, I'm sorry, over your square root of 7. And that would be it. And you would just click done. Okay, and it's going to look really weird inside of there, but when you submit it, it's going to look like 3 plus and minus the square root of 7. Okay, 10, simplify your answer into simplest radical form. Hint, the radical can break down. So if you wanted to show your work in here, that wouldn't be a bad idea. And what I would do is I'd recognize, well, hey, 32, what perfect square can go into 32 evenly? Now, 4 does go into 32 evenly, but it's not the biggest perfect square. The biggest perfect square is actually 16. So we could show our steps here if we wanted to. We would type in 3 plus or minus. I wouldn't start by retyping the square root of 32. I would just say, well, I'm going to change this to the square root of 16 times the square root of 2, because 16 times 2 is 32. Let's see, it doesn't let me go down another space, so I probably need to hit done. Now I can hit another space and I can go back to Math Quill and say, well, now I would have, I think I wrote 3 in the first one and it needed to be -7. I'm looking at the wrong problem. So -7 plus or minus, well, the square root of 16 is 4, and I can't take the square root of 2, so that remains 2. Okay, so I did, as you guys can see in that top one, I did mess that up. So it looks like I need to get rid of that 3 and make it -7. Then I think it'll all be fine, okay? All right, so that's how you would type it in. Again, you don't necessarily have to show your work in these boxes, but if you wanted to, that's how you can do it. Okay, so let's go back to all the other questions because I want to be sure to show the work for them and not just provide you with an answer. So the next one we have is 11. Now this one requires the quadratic formula. So what we can do is off to the side here, remind ourselves the quadratic formula is the opposite of b, plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And I know students that I talked to today said that they liked writing out what's a, b, and c. So by definition, a is the coefficient of the x squared. So in this case, that would be 4. Ooh, that's a 4. B is the coefficient of the x, which is 7. C is the constant, which is negative 15. And we just put all of that into the quadratic formula above. So the opposite of B, if B is 7, its opposite is negative 7. Plus or minus square root B squared. Well, 7 squared is 49. Minus the 4 that's always in the formula, times A, which is also 4, times C, which is negative 15. All of this divided by 2 times A, which is 4. Okay, so our focus is simplifying under the radical first. So when you are multiplying, you want to think, change colors real quick. You are multiplying these 3 numbers. Think of that 4 as negative. Okay, so negative 4 times negative 15. We have a negative times a negative, which is a positive. So this turns into plus. And if you multiply those together, it gives you 240. And then our denominator is 2 times 4, which is 8. So as you go through this, we're going to add underneath the radical now. And I get the square root of 289, which is a really pretty large number from ones that we have typically seen. And at first I looked at 289 and thought, well, can it break down? I thought, well, if that's such a big number, what's the chances that it's a perfect square? So I took my calculator and I typed in square root of 289, and sure enough, it's a perfect square. It's 17. So that means, let's go down here, we get negative 7 plus or minus 17 over 8. There's no longer a radical on the 17 because the square root of 289 is 17. Okay, from here we branch into our 2 answers. You have that plus minus. We've got 2 answers. So look at negative 7 plus 17 over 8 and negative 7 minus 17 over 8. Because that's where that plus minus comes into play. So simplify this top one, and that becomes 10 over 8, which is 5 over 4. And so you could put that into Canvas, or if you are going to put it as a decimal, that is 1.25. Either one of those is fine. And the denominator of this, negative 7 minus 17, is negative 24 over 8, which is negative 3. So no decimal needed there. Okay. So 12 is same idea, using the quadratic formula. Now this one, the directions are a little different. If you look at it, it says leave your answer in simplest radical form, which means no decimals. Okay, so when I get down to simplifying the radical, I've got to keep that in mind. On 12, A is 1, B is 8, C is 11. It's nice that that was all set up for me. So following my formula, the opposite of B is negative 8 plus or minus square root of B squared. 8 squared is 64 minus 4 times A, which is 1, times C, which is 11, all over 2 times A. So this is negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64. And this will be minus, because I have negative 4 times positive 1 times positive 11. So that's a negative, and that is a negative 44 all over 2, because 2 times 1 is 2. Okay, let's go ahead and do the subtraction under the radical. And I get 20. All right, so now to break down the radical, I am focused on the 20. And I go, well, what perfect square can go into 20? Well, the only perfect square, other than 1, that goes into 20 evenly is 4. So this is the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. Well, I can take the square root of 4, and it's 2. Now, I've got to remember that my denominator is still here. It's going to divide everything not under the radical, okay? So I need to make sure I do that before I present a final answer. So negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, plus or minus 2 divided by 2 is 1, and you can choose to write the 1, or you can just do radical 5 because the 1 is implied. Okay, so that would be your answer for simplest radical form, and you'd have to type that one in. Okay, 13 is also a quadratic formula. This one does say leave your answer as a decimal rounded to the hundredths place, so make sure you are paying attention to directions. And the other thing to notice is this is not equal to 0, so we need to make that happen first. Okay, so here A is 5, B is 12, C is negative 2. So if I start to put that in the quadratic formula, opposite of B would be negative 12 plus or minus square root. B squared is 144 minus 4 times 5 times negative 2 all over 2 times 5, because that's A. Okay, keep working through the radical. 144. I am going to have plus here because I have a negative times a positive times a negative. So I get plus 40 all over 10. And this gets me negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 184 over 10. Now, if you wanted to try to break down 184, you could. Off the top of my head, I don't know of anything that goes into 184 evenly, what perfect squares do. But I can put this all in a calculator at one time. Okay, so out of space over there, so I'm going to come down here. If I want to branch this out, I would need to type in negative 12 plus the square root of 184, then hit enter on your calculator. No matter which calculator you're using, hit enter, and then divide that by 10. And that should get you 0.16. If you're not getting that, then likely is that you are getting your calculator confused on order of operations. If you don't hit enter after the square root of 184, it's only going to divide the square root of 184 by 10 and not the entire numerator, which had the negative 12 plus the radical. Okay, same thing with the other one. And it looks like I'm off the page. Okay, so 12 minus the square root of 184 divided by 10. This is going to give you negative 2.56. So rounded to the hundredths place, those would be our answers. All right, and then the last ones were really quick. So 14 is what is the discriminant of that equation? So you've got to remember the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. It's just the piece of the quadratic formula that's underneath the radical. And what it does is it tells you the number of solutions that your problem will have. It doesn't tell you what those solutions are, but it tells you how many solutions you're going to have. So for 14, it just wants you to evaluate b squared minus 4ac. So in this case, b is negative 7, but even if you square it, negative times a negative be a positive 49. Minus 4 times 2 times negative 3. Okay, go ahead and multiply that out, and this does become an addition problem. And you have 4 times 2 times 3, which is going to give us 24. And add those two together, we get 73. So the discriminant is 73. All right, so when asking how many solutions that would give, So you have to think about where that placement is in the quadratic formula. It's underneath the radical. So all you've got to do is figure out, well, once you find the discriminant, if you took the square root of it, how many answers would you get? So for example, if we were asked to do that on 14, the square root of 73 is a decimal, but it would be positive that decimal and negative that decimal. So that's two solutions. So if we go into 15, what is the discriminant, or if the discriminant of the quadratic equation is 0, how many solutions do you have? If you square root 0, how many answers do you get? Just one. The square root of 0 is 0. There's no positive 0 and negative 0. There's only one answer and it's 0. So a discriminant of 0 says that you have one solution to the quadratic equation. Okay, last one is 16. So if your discriminant is 7, how many solutions does that have? Well, again, ask yourself, if you have the square root of 7, how many answers do you get? You get a decimal, but you get the positive of that decimal and the negative of that decimal, so that would be 2. The only one that wasn't talked about in this is, well, what if your discriminant was a negative number? Negative anything that you can think of. If your discriminant's negative, then you have no solutions because you can't take the square root of a negative, so that wouldn't work out. Hopefully this helped clarify some questions that you guys had. Feel free to view it as many times as you need. And then again, for your quiz, it is suggested that you attend the 9 to 11 or the 1 to 2 conferences with your teacher, just in case you want to have them available to answer any questions during your quiz.